My name is Mark Gordon. I'm from the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. And this webinar is being held to discuss the series of 8 articles on systemic risk and COVID-19 that were published on Prevention Web and co-authored by myself of UNDRR and Scott Williams, the co-chair of the GRAF Working Group on Fostering Systems Thinking. The series was published on Prevention Web from the 7th to the 17th of April 2020, and the link for which is provided in the chat box. You'll see that pop up in a second if you have not had a chance to see it. The format for this webinar is a 1 hour, and it entails 15 minutes of discussion of the articles by the co-authors, and then we will open the floor for you all to intervene and interact with us and with each other as we explore and unpack the issues that we've been discussing. But to begin with, I am delighted to invite the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction, Ms. Madam Mami Zutori, to provide the welcome. Mami, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mark, and nice to see you, Scott. I would also like to welcome all of you on behalf of the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction to this very important webinar. Today, I was just thinking about what we were doing a year ago this month. And we did organize the very important global platform for disaster risk reduction hosted by the Swiss government here in Geneva. Now, the global platform, as many of you know, is the global conference held every 2 or 3 years where all stakeholders committed to disaster risk reduction come together, and we learn how we are doing moving forward that agenda. Now, at that global platform a year ago, the Global Assessment Report on Disaster Risk Reduction 2019 was published. This was the first GAR published since the Sendai Framework was adopted. And I would say that the main message of this GAR 2019 was the systemic nature of risk that our contemporary global society is facing. Now, this was a very important message, and I think it resonated with a lot of us. But what is happening right now is that we are now living through that systemic risk with COVID-19. COVID-19, which started as a public health crisis, is now a socio-economic crisis, a global one, at a magnitude which now, according to the Secretary General, is plunging us into the biggest crisis since World War II. So it is very important at this time we look into what is the systemic nature of risk that we are all facing. One more thing that I wanted to mention is that 5 years ago in March in Sendai, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction was adopted. Before Sendai, the hazards that the disaster risk reduction community, and first and foremost the governments, were tackling were natural hazards. At Sendai, for the first time, human-induced hazards were introduced, and biological hazards was one of them. This was because of a very, very strong push from member states who had experienced outbreaks of Ebola, SARS, MERS, and H1N1. But I must say that unfortunately, we did not do enough in order to prevent the biological hazard, COVID-19 in this case, to become a pandemic. So now we are rapidly responding, and we are aiming for a better recovery. But that is not enough. We need to prevent better. We need to prevent so that the next biological hazard, which will come, will not become a pandemic of this sort. But that is not even enough, because what we also need to do is really understand the nature of risk that we are facing. And that I come back to the systemic nature of risk. So that's why I believe that it is a very important webinar, and I'm delighted that so many of you are joining us at the last day of the week. So back to you, Mark.
Thank you very much indeed, Mami. And I suspect that these words will resonate with you all. As you will have heard from the Special Representative, the Secretary General, now is a time for heightened global urgency. The need for ambitious collective action to better understand the systemic nature of risk, to build resilience and achieve sustainable regenerative development has never been greater. We are fast approaching the point where we may not be able to mitigate or repair these impacts from realized cascading and systemic risks, particularly those due to climate and ecological change, and right now, of course, in front of us, the COVID-19 pandemic. As was anticipated in the Global Assessment Report 2019, COVID-19 has revealed the precarious nature of the systems upon which trade, food, energy, transportation, and social safety nets depend. Worldwide, the social and economic environment, the physical environment, and lifestyles are being affected by this disaster. But it is these same systems that created the conditions for this virus to emerge, to propagate, and to become a global catastrophe. This impels us to improve our understanding of the interdependencies between system components. Ultimately, the choices made now in respect of risk and resilience to favor or sustaining human health in the face of COVID-19 will determine progress towards the goals of the 2030 Agenda and beyond. A return to normal is therefore a return to those same mutually reinforcing conditions that gave rise to the pandemic emergency in the first place. Resuming business as usual, i.e. rebuilding the same systems, will yield similar outcomes and generate more disasters. Framed correctly, however, actions that governments choose can transform the sectors that they seek to save. As you heard from the SRSG and indeed reiterated from the SG, the urgency is evident. It demands of all of us much greater ambition and action that is proportionate to the scale of the threat, not what is convenient, but what is necessary. As we have been reminded recently by, amongst others, Greta Thunberg, and even more recently by the threat posed by COVID-19, there are no gray areas when it comes to survival. Now we all have a choice. We can create transformational action that will safeguard the future living conditions for humankind and all other species, or we can continue with business as usual and fail. That is up to you and me, said Greta. And it is our choices that matter. And this is at the heart of the exploration of ideas and questions across the series of articles that we're discussing today. The Sendai framework emphasizes that risk is everyone's business. Never has this been more visible, more tangibly real for more people than it is right now in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. The entire series of 8 articles is intended not as a conclusive set of answers or solutions, but rather as a preliminary exploration, exposing the challenges and questions that we are faced with in better understanding the systemic nature of risks and the possibilities afforded by new approaches and new concepts of risk. This, we argue, will be the central challenge of the first half of the 21st century. Before I hand over to my co-author, I should add that we are, and the UNDRR, are deeply grateful to all of the contributors to the original material that appeared in the Global Assessment Report in 2019. And I should mention Michael Obersteiner, Franziska Gaut, Bob Bishop, Peter Head, Franz Gattweiler, Kirsten Dunlop, Nora Bateson, Molly Jahn, Kostis Varegas, Joanne Lindruth-Beyer, Stefan Hochreiner-Stigler, Kathleen van Heverschlein, Jiling Liu, and many others. Scott, would you take the floor?
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Ms. Tori-san, for your introductory remarks. Please allow me to also add my welcome to everybody. I think we now have over 250 on this webinar, which is a fantastic indication of the level of interest in this challenging and very important topic. The 8 articles that Mark referred to that we published in April on Prevention Web build over the course of the series, starting with a fundamental exploration of why the systemic nature of risk matters, and why we need a new view to understand the systemic nature of risk. And in doing so, explores the critical importance of the development of what we refer to as a 3-dimensional topographical map of risk through time, to not only be able to respond to disasters like the COVID-19 pandemic, but also to better understand the underlying complex and interdependent contexts and drivers of risk, as both Mark and Ms. Tori-san have spoken about. The series of articles then continues with the third and fourth articulating the importance of understanding the difference between complicated and complex systems and the fundamental characteristics of systemic risks. And then continues in the fifth article by exploring the question of whether systemic risk can ever be effectively governed. The sixth and seventh articles then explore the importance of building collective intelligence and new ways to generate relational information and warm data to better understand the dynamic nature of complex adaptive living systems and to empower individuals, communities, and governments to action. Which then leads into the concluding article in the series that introduces the vision, structure, approaches, and interlocking themes of the UN Global Risk Assessment Framework, otherwise known as the GRAF, and the possibilities of shifting the paradigm from managing disasters to managing risks to building resilience. This final article articulates the call from and through GRAF to focus on four main themes of action. First, to expand the data ecosystem, the availability and accessibility of data. Second, to map the true topography of risks to include the contexts and drivers and provide insights on the signals and thresholds. As Ms. Tori-san mentioned, to be able to prevent a health emergency becoming a global pandemic. Thirdly, to develop broader decision compasses so that our decision makers can focus on multidimensional outcomes, social, economic, and environmental. And finally, to incentivize risk reduction, to mobilize people, innovation, and finance at the epic scale and with the urgency that has now been made much more visible during the COVID-19 pandemic. And with that, back to you, Mark.
Thank you, Scott. In the Global Assessment Report in 2019, Chapter 2 were 10 recommendations. These are perhaps even more compelling as potential considerations for national and subnational governments, for the private sector, businesses, investors, and communities and citizens across the world, as we are all forced to explore the limitations of current systems and current ways of understanding, and explore different pathways into the future in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. The 10 recommendations are as follows. 1, accelerated action and ambition to transition from managing disasters to managing risks, from managing conventional hazards to engineering an improved understanding of the dynamic interactions with systemic risks. 2, changing deeply embedded values that define higher level rules of operation and interaction, to avoid the continuation of the creation of wealth at the expense of declining ecological life support functions in positive spiraling feedback loops that create systemic risks with cascading effects and make overarching economic, ecological, and social systems increasingly susceptible to collapse. Scott.
3, major renovations of approaches to risk assessment and analysis to shift from the current focus on the largest and most historically obvious and tractable risks to the full topography of risks. 4, the use of scenario building and stochastic simulations to facilitate thinking and decision-making in complex systems contexts.
5, activating the power of human, social, and contextual intelligence, and where possible, combining it with appropriately designed artificial intelligence.
6, developing the capability for trans-contextual understanding and decision-making by generating relational information as a more effective way of understanding and living with uncertainty and complexity than the present reliance on extrinsic frames of reference and categorical expertise siloed into disciplines. 7, focusing on place-based solutions and collaborative development of contextual relational information based on self-organizing around actions co-created with local ownership of data, risks, and solutions through mutual learning and the building of collective intelligence. 8, improving understanding of the interactions and interdependencies between urban and rural areas by developing a functioning urban-rural or city-region data metabolism to process information at appropriate scales to understand the system's implications and the systemic nature of risk. to provide actionable insights to decision makers about signals and thresholds ahead of periods of significant or irreversible discontinuity in the functioning of systems.
9, accelerating action by private sector financial institutions to integrate risk information into their core business models and practices, and rapidly shift to 100% risk-informed investments. 10, developing and encouraging new structures and approaches to bringing forward information and informing decision-making approaches that present the contextual interdependencies of potential systemic risk impacts, as they are felt at the individual microscopic level with larger global macroscopic contexts. These recommendations are inspired by the Sendai framework. For, as you heard from the SRSG earlier, in increasing the scope to include natural and human-induced hazards and risks, countries recognize the imperative of systemic approaches to managing the systemic nature of risk, so providing the connecting tissue for all the main global policy agendas, from the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, to the Paris Agreement, to the New Urban Agenda, to the Biodiversity Convention, to the Convention to Combat Desertification, and so many more. And with that, we now invite questions from you, our participants online. And just in the interests of time, and so as to ensure that we have the most inclusive and meaningful participation, if you wish to ask a question, please type this into the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of the screen, and we will endeavor to respond to these in turn. Participants being invited to put their question orally are asked to respect other participants and keep their questions concise and pointed. The floor is now open, and we have the first question. And can Brian tell us who is this from? Perhaps we turn to Peter Head, has put something in the Q&A. Perhaps, Peter, you could ask your question through the mic. Thank you. Peter.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I've been very much involved in disaster risk reduction, and I had a quick look at where we've got to with the global economy. And it seems that there's a hit to the global economy of around 10% GDP, which is quite a large number of about $8 trillion. And in disaster risk reduction, normally, as a rule of thumb, say it's worth investing about 10% of a disaster cost in order to avoid it in the future. So there's a very strong case for stimulus packages to include that disaster risk reduction sum. So it did seem to me that of the wonderful work that you've just described and the data and systems modeling systems that you've described, there will be a strong argument to get the science community together from all over the world and say, you know, surely we should fund putting this in place for the whole world, for all the countries on this call, so that they can actually do the things you just described. And I just wonder whether it's possible to convene them to do that.
Thank you, Peter. And I think this is the purpose of us having brought this forth in the context of the Sendai framework as within trying to inform alternative ways of thinking of the connectedness of our endeavors in moving towards sustainable and regenerative development. I would not go so far as to say, are we seeing this being enacted immediately? The emphasis is necessarily on the immediate response to the pandemic outbreak. But I think that there is an awareness as never before of the interconnected nature of systems in which we all reside, and the necessary realization of the consequences of action. There is still much to be done, of course, in how we can assist enhanced understanding of the consequences of our actions and how that can be incorporated into decision making. But this is part and parcel of the purpose of these kinds of interactions, and indeed the continuing inquiry that we will seek to support in helping all decision makers at all scales, from the individual through the households, right the way through subnational, national to global, of the role in which we can all play to understand how business as usual has contributed to the circumstances in which we currently reside. And there are conversations afoot that are recognizing that the systems that are currently so challenged by the pandemic crisis and the response are indeed those ones that we need to be addressing in a new light to determine how we can prevent such materializations of risk reoccurring with, I fear, increasing frequency. Scott, would you like to make any comment?
Yes, yeah, thank you, Peter. Both in Article 5, where we discuss some of the limitations and the challenges of being able to govern systemic risk and some of the successes and failures to date. And then also in Article 8, where we speak about the goal for the Global Risk Assessment Framework. And one of the statements there is that the Global Risk Assessment Framework seeks to reveal the interlinkages, the relationships, the correlations and dependencies of multiple risks and actors across systems, to build a shared understanding and enable decision makers to act. And very much in line with what you're saying, to enable decision makers to act in a fully informed way with the sort of numbers that you're talking about, to ensure that we do not lock in the same sort of systems dynamics that got us into this situation, as per Ms. Tori-san's opening remarks.
Thank you, Scott. We will endeavour participants to address each and every one of your questions, but I fear we'll run out of time. We will be recording this session and we will be recording all of your questions, and we'll endeavour to respond to them in due time. I will now look at the question from Anne-Marie Sharma, who makes a remark around the national platform for DRR, as guided by the global platform, is not active to proactively act to combat COVID-19. Am I wrong? So, Anne-Marie, the national platforms are the physical manifestation of the attempts by governments to pursue the goal and outcome of the Sendai Framework. And as such, they are seeking to enshrine that which the Sendai Framework encompasses in terms of all of state institutions, all of society approaches to understanding and managing risk. As you heard from the SRSG earlier, the inclusion of man-made hazards and risks into the discourse was introduced in 2015, 2016. And I think that many of these national platforms have been exploring how to include these additional elements into their existing architecture and their strategies and work. And that is a real-time exercise that we have seen some countries make significant advances, and many others looking to make much stronger demonstrations of being able to grapple with pandemic emergencies of this nature. So yes, there are moves afoot, and yes, the UNDRR and the entire UN system and others are seeking to support countries in being able to install the necessary mechanisms to be able to navigate the immediate crisis and indeed anticipate future crises. We have a question here from Fadi Hamdan. Would you please take the floor?
Hello, good afternoon. I want first to thank the UNDRR, Mark and Scott for this. I found chapter 2 of the GAR-19 extremely informative, and also the 8 articles which I am continuing to read. My question is, we're speaking about the systemic risk across environmental, social and economic systems, and looking at how governments are reacting and responding to the COVID-19 crisis. Is there also a threat to democracies in the way this COVID-19 crisis and in the way future systemic risks might manifest themselves, and how can we capture that during the systemic risk lens? Thank you.
Thank you, Fadi. I will briefly respond to this and then hand over to Scott. I think that one of the elements that comes forth in chapter 2 and in the articles, and you allude to in your question when you're looking at how do we ensure that we optimize participation and inclusivity, is exactly at the heart of how we are going to need to be able to support an enhanced understanding of the systemic nature of risk, because this can only be done by ensuring that we have, to the greatest degree, taken all that we know through traditional scientific endeavor together with contextual information that is, of course, location specific, but also dependent upon the inclusion of the many that would bring thoughts to bear in this consideration. And that is the notion of how we seek to try and encourage us all to explore new ways of learning and new ways of understanding what are the underlying root causes and systemic drivers of these types of risks. And that does require us to reach out and engage with a much more diverse and multidimensional spectrum of actors and decision makers, because all contribute in direct or indirect ways to giving rise to the conditions for such systemic risks to emerge and propagate or be prevented and managed. In your question, I suspect you're referring specifically to the response and the intervention by public institutions that has been recommended by the World Health Organization to try and limit transmission and spread. And these include measures that have been clearly restrictive on societies. But I think that if you look at those countries where the management of outbreak has been undertaken so effectively with the least loss of life, many of those interventions will have been justified in this particular period. And I would expect that was allow them to greater space to reflect upon some of the systemic issues in how they incorporate that into the immediate response and recovery phase. Scott, did you want to answer, or shall we move on to another question?
Well, I think we do speak to this at length in Article, particularly in Article 6 and also in Article 7, in terms of we refer to, under the conditions of extreme systemic risk that we are experiencing at the moment. It is a moment to be able to decide on and to be able to think about choices, as Mark mentioned earlier, in relation to deeply embedded values that then define higher level rules and shape attitudes and choices and behaviours going forward. We articulate or argue that there is a possibility for building greater collective intelligence, a more inclusive way of providing the information necessary for whole populations to be better informed about the risks to which they're exposed, and then to be able to act at all scales, both at a very localized scale, households and individuals, through to communities, cities, and then to nation states.
And perhaps, Scott, as you're building on that, because this comes from the relevant sections of Chapter 2 and the relevant articles, you could address Shivangi and Marian's questions, which are talking to the aspects of localization, dealing with the systemic nature of risk, and what role can artificial intelligence play in helping us to understand complex systems. Perhaps you can extrapolate, because you were beginning to talk to that.
Yeah, an important aspect of the shift that we are arguing is important from a more purely reductionist approach, approaching the systems in which we are intervening and making decisions as complicated systems, to seeing them as complex, adaptive living systems, is to be able to understand the interdependencies and the linkages across all levels. So what happens at a very localized level impacts at the global level, and likewise decisions taken at the global level reverberate down through state, subnational, city, community, and down to individual. So there is definitely a very important role for localized collective intelligence building, the downscaling of information to an appropriate scale for individuals and households to be able to make more informed decisions. And this is directly challenged by some of the issues which Marian is touching on in her question in relation to the use of artificial intelligence for either better or for worse, in terms of either the provision of more accessible and more usable information, or the dissemination of misinformation and non-constructive information, to which makes it even more difficult for populations at whichever level to be able to make risk-informed decisions, particularly under periods of high stress, as many communities are at this time. We do have an extended discussion on artificial intelligence and cyber risk in Chapter 2, where there is an argument that, yes, it is very important that we do build artificial intelligence capabilities, well-designed and appropriate artificial intelligence capabilities, but because of the complex nature of the challenges that we're facing and the need to be able to be dynamic, and the knowledge that human beings make decisions largely based on emotions, only somewhat underpinned by rational evidence and argument, that we need to also build that collective human intelligence, that ability to make decisions and to be able to live in uncertainty and understand that the decision environment is constantly shifting and that there is no perfect decision. There is no best decision. There are just better decisions and better understanding. And that is certainly one of the things we are trying to argue and explore and question through the series, is this notion that we will never get to a perfect understanding. Because as Heraclitus said 2,500 years ago, no person steps in the same river twice. There is a dynamic shifting of all of the contexts at all times, but having a better understanding of all of those contexts, whether it's at the local level, the national level, or even at the supranational level, the United Nations level, can inform better decisions and a better understanding of what the impacts and consequences of those decisions will be.
Thank you, Scott. We have a question from Shaila Khan and another that refers to how do these will have impact to reorganize and organize the UN, and how do we work? Is it going to lead us to a new development approach? And a second related to what degree have governments adopted systemic approaches to risk reduction, particularly in light of COVID-19? I think this is going to cause all public institutions and maybe all organizations to reflect very deeply on how we organize the entire chain of research, investigation, and inquiry through to the development and provision of information to decision makers at all scales, and how that is then factored into how those decisions translate in the real world through investments or behavior into the riskscape that we are currently constructing. Is that change and that shift going to happen straight away? In some instances, maybe, where you have the more agile and flexible organizations. In others, it will evidently take more time. Our education and research constructs have existed for a very, very long time indeed, with very well-established incentivization and reward structures that do not currently necessarily lend themselves to transdisciplinary investigation and inquiry, although this is starting to change. Likewise, in our decision-making architectures within governments or within the UN system, we have tended to take a reductionist approach of dealing with complexity by dividing up complex issues into discrete areas of investigation where specialization and mastery is acquired, but too often are separated from each other and not brought together into a single holistic homogeneous reflection. But I do see that changing, and I certainly hear within and see within the UN system that this is changing. The UN does have a common guidance on resilience, which is currently in the process of being finalized by a cross-system-wide group that is increasingly starting to grapple with the realities of interconnected and interdependent systems and how this contributes to the, excuse me, the creation and propagation of risks that are increasingly recognized as systemic. This we will continue to need to develop, and likewise in our national decision-making architectures and subnational architectures, where perhaps one can go so far as to say we see a much more significant commitment already to systemic thoughts and systemic approaches, because in particularly city region contexts, we see the realities of the consequences of ignoring systemic risk drivers being much more prevalently observed and felt. And that's something that I would expect to continue in that trajectory. We have hundreds of questions coming in. I'm delighted to receive all these. We are going to try and deal with as many as we can. So please be patient with us, and we will certainly seek to attempt to respond to all those that we're not able to respond to today.
Just on those last two questions, I would direct those questions to Article 5, where we do explore some of the challenges of systemic risk governance, to Mark's comments.
So Akhilesh Surjan, you ask essentially about the notion of this being translated to non-English speaking environments. And yes, this is absolutely at the core of what the UN and UNDRR seeks to try to do, to make this as accessible and understandable to as many as possible. We are moving into relatively new terrain. The aspects of systems thinking is not a new concept, it having been brought forth by many other communities, including the engineering community, amongst others. But we will be looking to try and make sure this is as inclusive a conversation as possible, for without it, it will not succeed.
I would just add to that in Chapter 2 of GAR 2019 on page 45, we do have a box of definitions listing various definitions, and I would say that those definitions are both right because they're written down, and they're completely wrong because this is an emerging area where the language is not doing justice to the complexity that we're dealing with. And so we certainly need to explore all sorts of different ways to be able to articulate what it is we're talking about and what the challenges actually are, and how people can be involved in those.
Thank you, Scott. Whilst you have the floor, did you want to try and respond to this question around, is there any applied example for the use of complex adaptive systems to understand resilience and risk in socio-environmental systems, or is it still in the research phase?
Yes, it is still in the research phase, but yes, there certainly are a number of practical examples of small and large-scale activity taking place. An organisation that I've been working with, the EIT Climate Kick, which is a body that sits with the European Union, has been exploring the application of a systems innovation approach to both city-region scale challenges, as well as to supporting regions across Europe to be able to build resilience. Beyond that, the UN system itself, through UNDP, is exploring a similar approach, moving towards looking at the portfolio of challenges and projects within their portfolio to be seen through a lens of complex systems rather than as complicated systems. And I'm aware that they're doing work, for instance, in Uzbekistan, in Vietnam, in Bangladesh, in Serbia, and a number of other countries around the world. And it is early days, absolutely, but there is an understanding and a commitment based on exactly the sort of research which underpinned this series of articles, that there is now enough research that it is time to start to undertake these practical demonstrations.
Thank you, Scott. There is a question here from Ranjit Premasiri. Are there any models developed to assess the dynamic nature of pandemic risk? The UNDRR is certainly not the competent authority to be able to talk to this issue. You would be better off speaking to the World Health Organization and other health agencies, and indeed various institutes of public health around the world. But yes, there are many models seeking to try and understand some of the dynamic aspects and indeed some of the upstream risk drivers. There will be a proliferation of research and studies moving forward through the period of the response and the recovery phase from COVID, which will unpack these in more detail, including some that will be supported by UNDRR. And as health systems modeling is a well-established arena. I have a question here from CS Dubey. Constant K in the sustainability systematics is always changing with climate and resilience and health effects. What could be the major parameters for risk analysis and future impact of COVID-19? Scott, do you want to try and grapple with that one?
That is a very big question. I think it is getting to the essence of what we are trying to explore within the series of articles, that it is the complex and dynamic nature, rather than a set of specific or rigid or potentially artificial indicators of success or progress. And when I say artificial, I'm referring to indicators which are extracted from all of the contexts in which the impact is being felt. To be able to guess at what the major parameters for risk analysis and future impact of COVID-19 are is a difficult speculative task. But the importance of being able to look through the lens of systemic impacts. So to be thinking more about signals, about thresholds, and the way that the dynamics of systems actually work, as opposed to static measures, as maybe have been focused on more in the past. It'd be good to move on to Irene's question there. I think that is a very important question that we grapple with at length in GAR 2019 and again through the series of articles. It is the importance of not just looking at the manifestation of the risks, the importance of moving down to understand the contexts in which those risks have manifested themselves at whichever scale. But then even more importantly is looking at that interdependent and incredibly messy space of all of the different contributing drivers to those contexts which result in the risks. And as we said earlier, there has been a preponderance to focus on the risks and then focus on how we can respond after those risks manifest themselves as disasters when they impact on human choices of where we live, how we focus maybe on efficiency within a supply chain as opposed to resilience, for example. So the opportunity which is enshrined in the Sendai framework to move from managing disasters to actually getting ahead of the curve and starting to manage risks requires us to be able to think more about the contexts and about the drivers. And that does take us into the messy territory of huge uncertainties and ambiguities and issues around the boundaries of what we're looking at. But to your point, can we learn from these mistakes? Absolutely. And that is in articles 6 and 7 on collective intelligence and relational information and mutual learning, is being able to create spaces for people to be able to come together, to be able to really share their learnings, not about elements of the system, but about what's happening within the systems within which they are existing and which they are feeling the impacts of natural and man-made hazards, which are then creating disasters and impacts on livelihoods and lives.
Thank you, Scott. I'll turn to the question from Bursak. Oh, it's just disappeared. Okay, which was asking, amongst other things, as being a supporter of disaster risk reduction, how is it that the risk reducing aspects that essentially are pre-event, ex-ante elements of prevention of the creation of risk or avoidance of the creation of risk and the reduction of the existing stock of risk so consistently are overlooked. And there are many, of course, many conditions that give rise to such elements being not addressed. But one element, of course, is the temporal nature of some of the risks that are being brought forth. In the context of the pandemic, as many of you will recognize, the precursor signals were there for us all to see. We had seen through previous pandemic outbreaks, but even between more contextual analyses of emerging propagating genesis and propagating factors, that we were building the conditions for species jump and then potentially for the rapid transmission of such a disease. The notion, however, of this being truly connected on a global scale had never really been brought forth quite like it has under COVID-19. And my sense is that this is a pivotal moment in time in terms of how we define the time horizons under which we determine what is pertinent to be considered and addressed in how we how we decide on our behavior, on how we decide and how we invest, and how that shapes our societies and the interactions between countries and communities. So I do think that despite the tragedy that this particular crisis presents for so many, and the enormous challenges that we all will face in seeking to manage the consequences of this moving forward, it does provide the possibility for an awakening quite unlike anything we've seen before, as to understanding that those time horizons that may have governed whether action was taken on the basis of existing knowledge will be fundamentally revisited and hardwired into potentially reconfigured mechanisms for taking decisions that are informed by the information that we know we have at our disposal. The challenge will be to be able to determine the mechanisms to do that, and to do that in a fashion that does draw from the collective knowledge and intelligence of the many and the diverse, as well as those that are more recognized. We have a question here from Amritjajit Saha, who thanks us for the presentation, but asks, who is the we? Is that citizens, national governments, and how does things like ethical consumption, open source information, etc., sit with a central profit motive of current production consumption patterns?
I was just typing out a beautiful response to that, Mark. But
well, then, this is a beautiful question. So
it is.
But given you started writing, why don't you begin, and then if I have time, I'll add in.
I said in response, it is a wonderful question, Amit Rajit. The we is everyone. As we articulated in Chapter 2 in GAR 2019, risk is everyone's business, albeit with a clear recognition of the differential potential for directly influencing outcomes. But as we also noted in recommendation number 2 that Mark read out earlier, it is important that as we move forward in better understanding the systemic nature of risk and understanding that we are living in uncertainty and with complex systems dynamics, that we change and challenge deeply embedded values, such as the pursuit of financial wealth at the expense of ecological systems functioning. And those recommendations are available at page 72 of the GAR 2019. And I think that it comes to the part of the point of your question there is sitting with a central profit motive of current production and consumption patterns, as included in the targets in SDG 12 on sustainable production and consumption patterns. And as we articulate in Chapter 2, that central motive needs to be re-examined. And I think in the COVID-19 pandemic context, many people are with the notion of what is essential and what is non-essential, what creates value and what doesn't create value. So certainly welcome you on this journey of exploration.
Thank you, Scott. I see now a fascinating question from Klaus Geiselhardt. You propose to think in terms of complexity theory, but how could this become globally accepted since we have different local cultures everywhere? Moreover, every institution, every organization, every field of practice has its own culture of discussion and thinking. How could such an abstract view like a systemic one become accepted worldwide? Well, Klaus, I hope you don't expect me to answer this question in this particular call. I would hope to have a conversation with you and other minds of a similar nature. But I think that this is part and parcel of what the systemic reality of this particular episode we are navigating brings to the many is fundamentally, how do we move forward in grappling with inculcating our learning from this into anticipating what it is we are building moving forward. And that necessarily will be only possible in a contextually relevant fashion. So I think implicitly your remark is well made, and the means and the manner in which we determine how we bring together those various facets in a fashion that is able to be understood, is able to recognize that which has not been heard in how we make recommendations for defining maybe even the very mechanisms of defining our current context and society will be an organic and evolving one, and one that will necessarily need to be experimental. And that experimental process moving forward, by its very nature, will involve some degree of success and some degree of failure, and from which we learn from both. The attempt in GAR-19 and these series of articles is not to impose a singular doctrine on a beautifully diverse and heterogeneous world. Our attempt is to introduce possibilities for alternative ways of thinking that will resonate, we hope, with an increasingly diverse community of stakeholders that must be involved in understanding context to determine potential solution pathways that are likely to maximize impact. Scott, did you want to dive in?
Yeah, just very briefly, I certainly welcome the question. I think it's a wonderful question. In no way are we looking at anchoring anything that is happening to either complexity theory, cybernetics, catastrophe theory, or any other body of technical language which just further creates barriers to being able to encourage people to engage differently. I think we include a statement at the start of the 7th article, which I hold very close to my heart, which is that we are trying to encourage a lightness in the way we hold thoughts that gives us room to learn, to shift our perspectives, and to keep a rigorous humility and confusion. And certainly the more that I explore these areas, the more confused I get. This is an area where language and theory to date has not been helpful in being able to create the sort of action that we need from people all over the world to be able to learn in a different way, to be able to feel engaged, to be able to be empowered to act in their interests and in everyone's interests.
Thank you, Scott. Perhaps we could invite Dennis Chang-Seng. Could you please take the floor and articulate your question?
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello, Dennis. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I had 2 questions, but I will go for the second one. In terms of risk transfer for such biohazard and also loss and damages, in future, would there be situations where organizations, business, and firms need to factor such risk in their business models? So that's the question.
I think most certainly, and again, one of the recommendations and certainly included within the main text of Sendai Framework in paragraph 36C is the encouraging of private sector institutions, financial institutions, investors, to be able to incorporate a wider range of risks into the way they make decisions. And importantly, that does call on potentially a reworking of the way that fundamental financial accounting principles work. Disclosure of information, transfer of information between companies, investors, and the insurance community to ensure that risks are more visible and better understood. With the caveat that we do not at the moment have those assessments, we do not have the models, but one of the things that we are encouraging and continuing to explore is emerging signs of practice where a broader range of risks, as Ms. Tori-san spoke to earlier in paragraph 15 of the Sendai Framework, the extraordinary widening of the scope from just natural hazards to man-made hazards, from a very limited range to a very, very wide range of risks, which necessarily means that we need to be thinking in terms of systems. Now, how that will impact on disaster risk financing measures, both in terms of insurance and reinsurance, but then in terms also then in how nation states are able to deal with those risks beyond the reinsurance pricing mechanisms, is yet to be determined and is being worked out, at the moment in the context of COVID-19. and is an important indicator for us to look at as we think forward into the challenges that the climate crisis and the broader ecological crisis present to us in the years ahead.
Thank you, Scott. And maybe just to add to that also that it gives greater fuel to the consideration of how do we fundamentally redress the fact that risk is critically underpriced in the value of assets in the broader financial system writ large. And this is not an easily resolvable aspect, but until we start to see a more accurate pricing of risk and asset value, and as Scott says, start to feature the notion of risk more comprehensively in the balance sheet of a company, we are not going to see that factored into financial transactions in the way in which we do business moving forward. So this is a fundamental aspect of that which Scott spoke to, including in the context of climate. And I suspect that given the enormous economic hit that we heard from one speaker earlier on that the world is facing, this will crystallize minds and thoughts in this direction.
We have so many good questions here, Mark, but we have so little time to answer them.
Yes, we have 4 minutes remaining. Now, we can, if you would like, extend beyond the hour to another 15 minutes, which will give us a time to address them all. But I suspect the SRSG, Ms. Tori-san, has to leave us at 3 o'clock. So perhaps I'll give the floor to Mami to make a few personal remarks on what she's heard today. And if people would like to continue afterwards, Scott and I can still be available. Mami, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the opportunity. I was listening very attentively. Your answers are very illustrative, but I learned also a lot from the questions, as usual. Now, first of all, I'd like to thank, as Mark mentioned, all the experts, our partners who have worked to bring the important message in GAR 2019 of the systemic nature of risk. And as you were saying, Mark, a year ago, who imagined that we would be here? Nobody, of course, right? But that's, again, the nature of risk, that you find yourself in places that you don't expect, but you have to be prepared for it. And the point is that, as you mentioned, Mark, we do need to change this crisis into an opportunity. I think that's clear. We talked about systemic nature of risk, but for many people, I think it might have been something very abstract. I understand it's still abstract and vague, but it is a reality that we are all living. And that question on who are we, that's very important, isn't it? Because it is everybody. And now in this crisis, everybody is living the crisis. Some people may not, the most vulnerable people may not understand what is the crisis they are facing, but the reality is that they are living it. So let's try to turn this crisis into an opportunity. And going back to the first question of Peter, it's not easy, but I do believe that, yes, we do need to advocate more for the need to really put prevention into the stimulus, if not the first one or the second one, but part of the package. And issues such as data, as Peter was saying, is so important. But we know that even in developed countries, it is very much underinvested. Even the strongest governments, they do not invest in data gathering, data collection, data analysis, and the use of data. So this is something that we need to advocate with our partners. And one more thing that I wanted to mention is that yes, it's very vague. It's very difficult. The good question about how do we actually implement this in different cultures? But that's actually what we are trying to do with GRAPH. As mentioned in the last article in the series. And in order to do that, we will move into the pilot project phase of GRAPH. And that will, I strongly hope, tell us how can we translate this very complex notion in itself into a reality, into a mechanism for decision makers in different cultures with different resource levels, but that is what we're trying to do. So we have a plan forward. And as Mark mentioned, I do need to leave, unfortunately, now, but I'm sure that there will be a lot of more good questions and answers, and I hope that we can answer all questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mami, and we're extremely grateful for you being with us.
Thank you.
I'm happy to continue for the next 15 minutes or so. So let's see what we have next on the list. And we clearly are not going to be able to answer all these questions. So my apologies, folks. So maybe we should organize a third webinar, Scott, so that we can start to get to some more of these issues.
Yes, and we will also have a log after this webinar of all of the questions which have been listed. And we will endeavour to try to respond to those, because we have many of your details from the registration process. So we will try and reach out. But we would also try and have at least a third webinar, I think, based on the interest. Yeah.
Very good. So let's get back to the questions. And one question that came through earlier that the SRSG referred to around the graph was, when do you anticipate guidelines of operationalization of graph becoming available? From Olga Shashinka-Pescaroli. So yes, these will be forthcoming shortly. We are as you heard from Ms. Tori-san, in the process of defining the national pilots, which they themselves are going to be the principal vehicle for us to be taking forth much of what we've been discussing today in an experimental space. This is going to be made public, and indeed through the Global Risk Assessment Framework community, supporting governments in the kind of reflections that many of you have been asking questions about. That will, we hope, start to encourage decision makers to challenge some of the very assumptions of the adherence to normal that will need to happen. And I see that there is a question here from an anonymous attendee. What would be your recommendation to ministers and decision makers to ensure the post-COVID packages will not replicate BAU? Where can we find data that supports the notion that we need to change urgently, given the climate change crisis has not succeeded in making the case? Why and how can we make it now, especially when fossil fuels are reducing its price so dramatically? I suspect that the question here is politely keeping it focused, but in fact it is, of course, much broader than that, in terms of, I guess, our aspiration. I think it's inherent in the comment around opportunity that you heard the SRSG refer to, as to fundamentally questioning the very nature of our economic models as favoring economic optimization above human and ecosystems health. Is that going to be something that will the penny drop now? Will that realization be made real in the response to COVID? Well, this is partially why we're having these kind of conversations, to see if we can't build a groundswell of clear argument and intelligence that can advocate for these kind of reflections to be incorporated. We do have a sense that there is a much greater receptivity for these, for such deeper reflections in certain contexts on all scales. There will be, of course, enormous pressure, and the current incentivization structure to resume economic activity in the path of least resistance, which would be the resumption of business as usual. But I have certainly not observed conversations of the notion of opportunity around fundamentally rethinking these paradigms certainly before, and we should certainly seek to try and fertilize and ferment that. Scott, did you want to make any comment on that particular question, or shall we move on?
I have many comments, but let's move on.
Okay. Carr Fenson asks, how can we learn which decisions to make on which levels? Is there an idea for this? Scott?
There certainly is, and through a number of the articles, I think in particular in Article 7, where we talk about the importance of relational information and warm data, and helping people to be able to shift their perspective from a siloed perspective, seeing the economy as separate from family, as separate from technology, or separate from the environment, to actually being able to understand and perceive the interdependencies in the same way as they do very naturally in terms of all of the different components of the system of their body. And through being able to help people to be able to start to see that these interdependencies are not just some abstract theoretical construct, but that they are real. Now, COVID-19 has been very helpful in that regard, in helping people to see that some of the separations which previously seemed somewhat more permanent were not as permanent, and that in fact we are sort of seeing a mushing together, a collapsing of some of the boundaries, and people are grappling with what does this actually mean? With many kids at home from school, the education system has collapsed in with family, with the economy, with people working from home or working remotely in some capacity. There's been a merging together of different systems which did appear to be separate. So yes, there is in the 7th article where we talk about how to generate relational information, some ideas for what can be done. Warm data sessions that are being undertaken by a number of institutions at the moment. It is very important, as Mark said at the opening and in quoting Greta, that people really do understand that it is individual choices that do make a difference. And in helping to ensure those choices are informed by a perspective of the functioning of systems and the interdependencies rather than the separation between is an important first start as we move forward.
Thank you, Scott. There's a question here from Bursak Basberg Erkan. Would you like to take the floor? Your question around health issues versus disaster.
Yeah.
Hello. I asked several questions. Is it the last one you mentioned? I missed which question you said, please. Sorry.
The one where you said countries are treating COVID as a health issue.
Yes, I'm from Turkey, so how it started, but I live in UK. How it started, it was the Ministry of Health who took the responsibility and took action in every step of the way. Although many times, like myself and my other colleagues several times mentioned, it's a matter of disaster management, actually disaster risk management it should have been. But it started as like a health issue, and it's still ongoing as a health issue, of course, in collaboration with other stakeholders. But how would you convince, say, policymakers to see it in the bigger picture, like being a pandemic as a biological hazard which should have been invested, and it should have took place in starting from post-Sendai onwards, and even going back to Hyogo time, and how do we separate it from the just being a health issue, just being a overall broad DRM? Thank you.
Happy to have a first attempt at that. That's a fantastic question, and we do explore this in the 7th article on how to generate relational information to inform the systemic perspective. And in particular, there's a subsection on transcontextual response. And we specifically, it's amazing that you've raised that, because we do mention that health crises, specifically we say health crises remain in the realm of health ministries, while economic issues are under the separate attention of ministries of finance or employment. And likewise, ecological risks overlapping with cultural or political risks are still in most cases considered in parallel within the Ministry of Environment. And this is true of most governments at national and subnational all over the world. I think in some of the discussions that certainly I am involved in both regional governments and national governments, there is a growing understanding that the challenges that are being faced, which are complex and intractable in nature in relation to the approaches that have been adopted to date, which have been traditionally a linear approach, planning and evaluating, doing, and then monitoring, are not actually addressing the complexity of the issues that they are in theory being employed to make an impact on, a positive impact on. And that therefore a different approach is required, and an approach which actually does look across ministries, that does look across all different facets of society, economy, ecology, are increasingly being welcomed. From my personal perspective, it is still early days, but certainly a number of governments that I'm working with and that I'm familiar that others are working with are starting to inquire and starting to put programs in place to be able to train bureaucrats and ministerial staff to be able to start to understand beyond just a single ministry mandate. And maybe COVID-19, the pandemic, is an opportunity to be able to accelerate some of those early activities and early actions.
And as I mentioned earlier, this is going to be need a multitude of reflections in a multitude of domains. The ability to be able to knit together, because you talked, Bashak, about the separation between ministries and therefore the separation of the address of a shock or a problem. The change to really genuine transdisciplinary interaction in taking different information sources and incorporating that into decision making, I think is coming, and I agree with Scott. I suspect that COVID is going to accelerate that process, but that needs to be underpinned by shifts and an evolution in every aspect that feeds into that, whether it's in our research and scientific endeavors to ensure that we aren't, that the reward and incentivization structures that give rise to our academic communities be remaining in largely departmentalized or compartmentalized structures, moving towards a more convergent drawing together of that knowledge to be able to provide risk insights that are more reflective of reality than traditional reductionist approaches have fomented, is also giving rise to and we hope a new cadre of decision makers that will be thinking systemically rather than in a singular sectoral fashion. And we are seeing areas where this is starting to move forward. In food systems and nutrition, this is certainly something that is particularly evident. We see at different scales and in different contexts. But it is not something that is going to change overnight. And that's I think at the heart of your question: how do we make sure that we continue to make this clear? COVID, unlike any other shock that I have seen, certainly in my time with UNDRR, has made more apparent the intrinsic relationship in terms of both drivers and the root causes of the pandemic emergency, as well as its consequences. I would certainly, I'd be convinced that certainly UNDRR and the entire UN system, and I imagine multiple realms of those interested in this area will be pushing our governments and our businesses and our investors to be recognizing the role that they play in how their decisions craft the conditions for a similar catastrophe of this nature to be replicated.
I think an important sort of bit of shorthand that I certainly carry with me is whenever I'm thinking of have I got a systemic perspective, I'm thinking, am I completely confused? And I think this is a really important point, that our government officials, those entrusted with high responsibility and potentially high salaries, are trapped into feeling and having pressure applied to come up with answers, to come up with specific solutions, and not to show doubt, and not to show confusion, and not to be able to articulate the paradoxes between the different choices that they have in front of them. And I think that is incumbent on all of us, as well as importantly, those higher level decision makers, to be able to have that humility to be confused. This is a very confusing time we're all in. We're all locked down at home. Governments are making decisions on the fly. The oil price has gone negative. There's other very, very unusual things going on in all of your micro, household and individual level, but also then at the national and multinational level. And I think admitting that we're confused, that we don't really know what's going on, but we are trying to, both individually and collectively, to have a better understanding, is an important first step. Releasing ourselves from the tyranny of expertise, from that siloed, categorized expertise that I know what I'm talking about. I'm very sure that I don't know what I'm talking about most of the time. And I think it's an important thing to hold as we try and explore how we are going to grapple with these sorts of very complex challenges going forward.
On that note, I think I'm a bit conscious of time, but I do want to give the floor for two more people before we finish. But it strikes me that what we have here is, I mean, an enormously rich community of thought who have clearly had some very deep reflections on this issue. I'm wondering whether we should not try to organize another session where we can take many of these questions and have a more open discussion rather than the rather two-way discussion that's been going between the panelists and yourselves, where in many instances we will have shown just what we don't know, being transparent and about that, but trying to learn from you also as to how we can chart a pathway forward. So we'll have a think as to how we can try and engineer that so that we can make the most of your expertise and your perspectives on how we take this forward. To conclude, I would like to invite if Cecilia Chow is online to put her question to the community.
She is no longer online.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, so let's hear one last question then from Mark Harvey. Mark, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Yes, we've been focusing a lot on the need for a shift, a transformation towards a new way of managing risk that is systems oriented. But I wonder whether actually over the past 3 months we haven't seen some really good examples of what you might call systems approaches, the use of open data ecosystems to harvest data from across the world from different institutions. Some amazing examples of platforms that connect haberdashers and tailors with care homes and hospitals to stitch together and deliver personal protection equipment, breaking down those barriers and systems and silos that Scott referred to that we've taken for granted somewhat. So I think my question really is, might it be possible to take those 10 recommendations and attach to a few of them some really good examples that have emerged, perhaps more in the response and the resilience category than the direct risk reduction category, but they nevertheless kind of embody aspects of those 10 recommendations that you began with?
Now it may appear, folks, that we had choreographed that to be our concluding remarks, but actually that was quite spontaneous. So thank you, Mark, for that. I think that's an excellent idea. That perhaps might be a useful way in which we can provide the bridge into further discussions of this nature. So please, all of you online, I am deeply grateful for your participation. Your wisdom and insight is what keeps us going and what keeps us trying to move this conversation and this discourse in a direction that fundamentally helps, will have impact, and ensure that we are able to anticipate and avoid the kind of shocks that we are navigating at the moment on such enormous scale for so many. So I think, Mark, that's an excellent idea. We will find a way to be able to provide the opportunity to people on this call, and please do circulate with your networks to provide feedback against the 10 recommendations as to practical examples as to how this may have been observed in before, during, and after the COVID pandemic emergency. And I think it would be also rather interesting if we can continue this conversation, perhaps using some of your questions and your observations that we have received, and they are many, thank you so much, as the organizing construct for taking these conversations forward. As you will have heard from the SRSG, the Global Risk Assessment Framework is one vehicle that we're putting forward as trying to help bring some of these perspectives into the practical considerations of national and subnational decision makers, but it is, of course, not the only avenue. We will have additional inquiry being developed through the Global Assessment Report 2022, the call for papers for which will be coming out in the next couple of months. So I would invite you also to be looking to contribute in that fashion. We've had numerous questions as to whether the session has been recorded. It has. We will be making the recording available to you all. So please do keep your eyes fixed on the prevention web space and other communication media across the suite of social media. I think all I need to say now is with humble gratitude, thank you very much for your time, your energy, your insights, and on behalf of Scott too, we are extremely recognizant of this being a learning journey that we can only complete together. So we wish you all well. We wish you safety and be safe, and looking forward to continuing the conversation in the future. Thank you all and goodbye.
Thank you.